Good morning. This is Carl Dakin, and this is the Successful Funding Show. This is where I invite people like Ron Yeager, my guest this morning, to come onto the show, and we talk about funding. Funding means the raising of money to fill the gaps in your business plan when you don't have enough money to do anything that you want to do, whether it's starting a business, growing the business, a community project, or maybe a charity that's seeking to pay the bills this year. But all of these things often require going out and asking somebody else to give you some money to do what you want to do. And that can be hard to impossible. And our goal here is to try to make it a little bit easier, shed a little bit of light on how to do it, how to do it best. And today, my guest is Ron Yeager, a longtime friend and associate. Ron has worn so many different hats, like myself, that it would take too long to describe all of them. But he has worked as an investor. He has been a
Mhm.
scout for investors. He's managed companies, started his own companies, has a number of projects underway himself. And that makes him a person who, in my mind, has the broadest viewpoint of looking at the question of investing. And today, what we're going to talk about, which has been promoted on my instant funding newsletter, is that investors come in different flavors, meaning that when you're raising money for whatever you're raising money for, not everyone will fit the bill. Not everyone's a good candidate for your particular project. And if you want to limit your time and your cost and your stress and improve the probability, you want to go out looking for those people who are most motivated to put money in your pocket. So, with that, Ron, good morning. I'm glad to have you here. I appreciate your coming on the show again,
Mhm.
and you're sitting still this week, which means you're not a road warrior, at least at the moment. So, how you
Thank
doing
you.
this morning, Ron?
I'm doing well. Thanks, Carl, for having me on your show. I'm doing really good. This is a great week coming up. Yes.
Yeah, so Ron is working on state-of-the-art software engineering stuff. He is working on vineyards. He is looking at new medical products. It's a potpourri of different things out there. And the thing is, in each of them, Ron is raising funding, and the people who you would match to those particular projects are all different. Would that be a fair guess?
That's very accurate. It's a fair guess and accurate. Um, and it's, each opportunity has a unique story, and it has a unique set of investors that go along with that story. And yeah, it's a very accurate statement. I mean, I saw the promo for this with all the ice cream flavors. I don't know if you reached the Baskin Robbins level of 31, but there's more than 31, that's for sure.
Yeah, no, I found that picture, and since we were setting records here in Denver for temperature, the thought of ice cream was very appealing, and the smiley faces they carved into the each of the ice cream scoops was kind of fun. So that's kind of where I went
That was
with
good.
that. But so when you have a new project sitting in front of you, and you're thinking, I've got to go raise money, how do you go about figuring out who to talk to? What flavor of investor would be the right one?
Right. Yeah, and I have four projects. I would call it four projects currently, two of which that began prior to this year, and two of which began this year. And it's a unique what we do and what I do when I have the team that I'm invited to be a part of or we create. We come up with obviously what's the goal, and then we look at the we define that it's not just a casual conversation. It's it's what is the goal, and the every goal has needs, and so then we define those and we flesh those out. But from the very beginning, it's because I do have a network now, and I'm introduced to new networks frequently. I'd say at least quarterly, a whole new group of people I meet. Um, then you start as you're establishing what the goal is, and the process to get there. I'm always in the back of my head thinking of who, what entity, what individual, or what group of individuals would be a good part of this that would be relevant. And so that's how that works. And even with the two projects that began prior to this year, um, the original investors may not be as relevant, and there were new investors that have seen where we're at as we de-risk certain things in the software tool company, for instance. It presents a whole new set of investors, and we weren't at that point prior to de-risking it by advancing the technology. So even within a deal, there's many flavors of investors. It depends on where we're at. And right now, this year, the second half is going to be very interesting for us. So we have a lot of things in place, a lot of things lined up. But a good entrepreneur um, drives that forward really well, and they also prepare for eventualities that weren't anticipated.
Yeah,
So
we're very familiar with the constant series of surprises as an entrepreneur. So,
yes,
when you say you start looking for someone, and this is, we're basically asking for the secret sauce because most everybody I want to will come to me and say, I need to raise funding, and they expect me to reach out into the 8 billion people on the planet and pull out the one or the group of people who are going to write a check this afternoon. And I try to point out to him that I don't know who you are. I don't know your business necessarily, or unfortunately, in some cases, I may know your business better than you do, which is not speaking strongly to your capabilities. But to find the right in person, the right investor group or organization, you really need to dive down into what it is that the company is going to do. I talk
right.
about the benefits that come from the success of a company,
Hmm.
and how do you go about figuring out what that is and who you need to talk to? Is it something that you have this unusual inborn talent that no one else has, or is it a skill that can be developed over time?
Um, it's it's those two things and more, actually. And the unusual inborn talent, it just needs to be a drive and something within yourself where you can figure things out. You can get to the starting line or the finish line or close something. So that's an inner talent. It's not something necessarily you need to be born with. It's something you need to cultivate and curate and make it really good as part of who you are. And there is no switch. And I'm empathetic if someone comes to you, Carl, and says, I need you to find an investor for this. It's not like you can go out amongst the people on this planet and flick a switch and then it's automatic. It's not like that. It's you're entering a marriage, a business marriage. And so there's a dance that you need to consummate. And depending on who you're working with, it that determines where and how that's done. It might be on a golf course over a series of golf events. It might be just meeting people at a coffee shop. But if I'm meeting people first time that are investors, um, my body of work and my references uh, are really important because that's the only thing they can measure me on. They can't measure me in the present per se versus the deal or the opportunity, but they look at my history, what I've done, and that includes successes and failures, because the failures, there's a lot of cliches attached to failures, but failures, yes, it is the tuition, and it is where you learn how to handle objections along the way. And the successes speak for themselves. And then, but what were the steps that made that a success? So with new, and I have re-entered into a group of potential investors that first met me in 2018 to 2020. And so we stayed in touch. There was nothing specific for them to become involved with, and vice versa. They didn't need my skill set to do anything. And then, earlier this year, because we have moved far and with our software company and our tool, um, those investors became potential investors became very relevant. And so I went and revisited them. And fortunately, I had prior, mostly social interactions with them, whether, you go out for a beer or you never golfed with them, but other things that we've done together. And so then that gives them ease with me. They're comfortable with me. They're confident with me. They're confident that what I'm going to say isn't necessarily going to be embellished, and it most likely is truthful. And so then that's the relationship you need. And fortunately, I've been through that so many times. I have a lot of good relationships, but you need to match the money and the investment to the opportunity. So, and amongst all the flavors, there's also um, there are different personal, I don't know what you'd call it, just traits. So, in other words, if you want a passive investor, because that deal is going to take a little bit longer to mature and to become profitable, then yes, you need a passive, studious, intelligent investor, so they can understand that it's not, you didn't just build a highway to drive down easily to get from point A to point B. You're building the highway. Okay. And so they need to understand that. That is my most preferred investor. But there are other people that, they're more, their personality comes into it, and they're more aggressive or assertive, and that's fine. That works for them. It gets results. I mean, I worked for a Fortune 36 company that's how they did things. And it was like a private military company, United Parcel Service. So I understand that as well. But at the end of the day, as long as everyone respects each other, and as long as the person or the company that's being invested into, as long as they show progress and rather quickly, then I think that actually solidifies the relationship.
Yeah, so you raised several different points
Mhm.
that are, I think, critical to establishing a relationship with an investor. And I have three primary points I make out is one, you need to know the investor, the business or whoever, whatever's the opportunity has to know the investor,
Yep.
because without that, there's no trust, there's no understanding necessarily that's going to cause them to want to enter into an investment. And at the same time, they have choices. The any investor out there probably is getting one to a dozen different investment opportunities a week to take a look at, whether they're looking
Oh yeah.
intentionally, they're just somehow creeping in the house. Um, and this is a really important thing that I have a hard time getting across to some people is that you're looking for money, and so is everybody else.
Right.
And as much as you love your project and you want to do what you want to do, and you may think this is the better than sliced bread kind of a thing, so does everybody else. And they're all saying the same story. They're all basically on the same wavelength. It's like tuning in an AM radio and finding out that you can get 23 different radio stations, all
Yeah.
the same bandwidth. And the person's going to try to figure out which one am I going to pick, and the relationship between the investor and the person seeking the money is often the tipping point or the most important factor that goes into that. But you also raise several other interesting flavors, as we will call it, which have to do with, you said you didn't have anything in 2018 that matched up with what these guys were doing. Well, what do you mean by matching up? And explain a little bit more about, what an investor wants. What does that mean?
Right. Okay. That's a great question. Because it seems like there's a simple answer, but there's not. Um, but perhaps I won't use that specific example to start off with, but I will say that in in a lot of the investors I've solicited with and invested with, if there's a cause that the investment resonates with me personally, then that helps me get to the starting line on the investment. There's a cause, you're rallying around something, you all believe in this, you think you could be a force of change for this. For instance, in 2018, let's call it 2020, uh, when I had known one or more people of high net worth for 2 years. And casually, then, we spoke about what we've done, what we're doing, major projects, things like that. That because we weren't even at proof of concept, there was no way to talk to that level of investor. But assuming that we achieve proof of concept article and we move forward and we're right at the throes of a prototype, then they became much more relevant, because I don't want to have to spend a lot of time convincing people or educating investors to really look at this, and it needs to mostly fit what they're used to, because they're not going to change their cadence. They're not going to change and go outside of the box that far from their investor thesis of what they want to do. So as the company that I have, my partner and I, as it's matured, it became a better marriage, and it's just that's how it works. But when someone asks me, I meet someone new and they need help with their company, and I do volunteer this a lot. I volunteer to mentor and coach startups and other people, and but uh, they want something immediately and right away. And what it is, it's like I said, you cultivate these relationships, and they're not superficial necessarily. I mean, I know a lot of people, and some of the people, I can talk to them every 4 months, every 6 months, and we kind of pick up on where we left off. That's it. And so nothing about it in these interrelationships is superficial, or it should not be, because it's not going to work. Because the trust is a mutual thing. It's going to go two ways. And years ago, I had a packaging product company. I was in Memphis, Tennessee. The product was jamming in machines, and it wasn't working because the paper that was going through this machine, it responded to the local extremely high humidity. I had to make a phone call the next day to our group of investors that I recruited, and I invested in this myself, but I had to make that phone call the next day to ask for, and well, I stayed up all night, assessed what we needed to do to fix this immediately so that we didn't lose this customer in the prototype the beta test we were doing. Uh, so the next day I had to make the phone call and had to uh, recruit another $400,000 into this immediately to address it and fix it, because we knew the specific issue. And we actually went back to the paperboard manufacturer, and they had a solution. And then when the solution needs to happen immediately, let's say in 72 hours or less, it's going to be more expensive. But it'll be much more expensive if we don't come up with that solution. We'll lose this opportunity. So that was an existing investor base. I knew, because of how we communicate formally and informally, I knew that this was going to be a shock, but it would get done, and so that's fine. And so people at that point, in that particular instance, they had an opportunity to make an additional investment, pro rata, based on their ownership shares or of units of the LLC. And so that's how we overcame that. But the reason why we overcame that is because everyone was aligned on the goal. A lot of people came from the industry that is packaging, protective packaging, shipping, logistics. So they got their head around it really quickly. If I would add a different set of investors, a group of investors from outside that industry, it it would have failed. Is my I would have had talking to 7 to 13 individuals. It would have been a really big chore, and it had a 50-50 chance of failing. I knew the night that this happened, we had a problem. I knew within 24 hours there's a 99% probability we'd get the money there to fix it. So that's how that works. And a lot of those investors and future things I was involved with, they actually, some of them, most of them did not want to be involved because it was outside their how they think and their risk tolerance, things like that. And but some have asked me. They said, "Hey, we'd like to be a part of this next thing you're working on, the next big thing," which is there's been several things. And I politely disqualify them because it won't work. I know how they think. I know how they react to challenges. And not that they're a bad person, it's just not a fit. And so, I guess I'm making the ice cream, right? I have different flavors that I come up with for investors. And I don't know. I
Well,
like ice cream, by the way.
I actually agree with you. I take the position that out of the entire world, running from somebody in a developing country who may be having a hard time coming up with $10 to somebody who's sitting in some kind of suite in New York City who could write a check for $10 million. They all have their reasons, their motivations to invest, and they all have their preferences. And at the end of the day, like every business is unique, every investor is unique.
Yes.
And so knowing that and knowing that I have such a huge spectrum of people that I may want to talk to on a particular deal, I have to figure out how to zero in on those who are most motivated, those who best fit, where I call it a funding soulmate, somebody who
Yeah.
actually is looking for you. They don't know you exist or they haven't found you yet. And you're trying to bring these two groups together so that funding can occur. Um, the group you described, you met them way back in 2018. You were too early. As I understand it, you're still too early, but you're inching closer to that threshold where you think their risk tolerance, the development of the technology are starting to come into alignment. But what
Yes.
if somebody comes to you with a new project, new idea, and says, "Hey, I want to raise money," and you're asking yourself, well, where would I go to find somebody? Is it limited to the people who uh, do you go to people you don't know? How do you find somebody, I guess, in a hurry that you don't know?
Wow. I've never heard the question asked like that before. Um, you know, I'll start by saying that um, everything I know is usually not relevant. I try to throw everything I know out of my head every so often, and then reaccumulate that knowledge at its current level. Because what I've known, I know how to. I know when I was younger, I put a timing chain on an engine on an automobile, and I'm pretty sure that they don't make timing chains anymore. So that information is irrelevant. The timing belt is there. Okay, so there's something new. So, but I'll give you an example. Okay, I was involved in Boulder Startup Week in May, and in Boulder, Colorado, and this is for entrepreneurs. And then I volunteered to. Uh, Actually, they have tables set up and they put sticky notes down. So if you're an entrepreneur and you need help with something, you leave that on a sticky note. So I perused these and I looked at a couple and I thought, oh, they're looking for a business coach, they're a startup, whatever. I met with them and they're doing an app to map bicycle trails, or not map them, but to describe the current real-time conditions on existing bicycle trails. And it's a community app where everyone feeds into it, so you get local things. Like, for instance, it rained the last 2 days and the trail is slippery and muddy, things like that. And so then, they need some money. uh, And I actually I looked at my world of resources, and there's a that's a small company, they're startup, they don't need as much money, and there's a lot of risk. So most of the people at the private equity group and above, they're not even going to want to care about that, anything like that. And what happened is that one of actually two of the people I met during Boulder Startup Week at social events that were scheduled, I got to know them, just talked to them briefly, and two of them were a great match to be investors for this company. And I did put them together. I made the warm introduction. I can't vouch for the credibility of the entrepreneur, the husband and wife entrepreneur. I can't vouch for the credibility of the potential investor. And so, but it seemed like they were in the same headspace, the same space, the same interests. I know the investors like to bicycle. They like to go mountain biking. They're into e-bikes, electric bikes. And so I put them together and it's going really well. I don't think they've consummated the full investment because I think they're redefining what the necessary next investment is. And so that's how that one worked. But that model and that template, uh, that exact thing won't work for anything else I ever do. But
Right. No, it's unique, and
yeah,
this is, and at the same time, I appreciate your describing the fact that you facilitated an introduction, but you could not endorse or either the business or the investor to each other. You're saying like you two sound like maybe it would be good for you to have beers together or something because you have a common interest, but that doesn't mean that the business is worthy of an investment or that the investor is capable of making the investment. And so this is a little bit of a trial and error in building a brand new relationship from scratch in a hurry, in hopes that it may evolve into an investment.
yes,
And unfortunately, I'm going to say it this way: this is the way a lot of people raise money. They start off going, I need money, but they have no idea how to talk to them. They don't have any idea what kind of deal would be more attractive or less attractive to the next. And then they go out talking to everyone. And it isn't like you can't meet a whole bunch of nice people that way, but it's not efficient. You don't have all the time in the world to meet everybody and go, yes, 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 no, 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 yes, yes, you know, and go through this process. And then as you described it, there was not an instantaneous check writing taking place. They
correct.
now had to start the process of building a relationship, building the trust. And it's been my experience that this is all doable, but it may take
Mhm.
up to 6 months or more before that relationship is thorough enough, strong enough, whatever you want to call it. And it's only because you happen to be in the right place at the right time to meet this person and know that they might be a fit with this person. And so without your presence, they could still be wandering the halls of Boulder Startup Week, looking for an investor candidate. But before we jump into that, Harvey Tuck is with us this morning. Harvey is one of my mentors and a member of my cohort with Don Cohen, where we're trying to use LinkedIn Live as a communication tool to share information, to build our networks, and to do great good for the world. And Harvey does two LinkedIn Live shows on franchising. And
Mm,
one of them is about the industry, where he's now becoming kind of an influencer of highest level and bringing together all these people who know about franchising. He's also doing the franchising show where he gives people who are thinking about a franchise or have a franchise as a franchisee an opportunity to learn a little bit more about how to improve their business and make it more successful. But most importantly, Harvey has accepted my invitation to put a question in front of me and Ron as my guest. And the question is, I have a question. Is it important for investors, for the entrepreneurs, and that's the people who are the founders, operators, managers of the business, to have skin in the game? And by this phrase, this means that sometimes a person will come to you as an entrepreneur and say, I need to raise money. And the investor says, how much do you have already invested in this business? And in my mind, this is a good question, but it may also be misleading or inaccurate when we get down to the end of the day. Um, because the skin in the game can be cash that's been invested to date, which there may be substantial, even though it's not invested in a classical sense, been picking up direct expenses, piling up outlays of money into this. But you also have the time of the entrepreneur that goes into this. And in many cases I've been involved with, the amount of time invested so far outweighs the amount of cash invested that it represents the single largest form of investment. So when somebody says, "Do you have skin in the game?" I typically will give them two answers. I'm going to go, "I've got this much cash, and I've got this much time," and this is important because if they respect me and my time and who I am and what I'm doing, then my investment of time is given credit.
Mhm.
If they don't believe in anything except cash as a metric for investment, then my time means nothing, and therefore we're probably not going to have a very long conversation. Um, so in this case, Harvey's asking if you had a project required $1 million of investment, and the entrepreneur was prepared to put in all the time and effort, but had very little. I'm gonna have to read off the scale. Little or no money. Does that ever happen? And the answer is all the time. Uh,
Mhm.
this is an interesting confluence of an opportunity, a person who wants to be a champion to bring that opportunity to market, and their existing resources when this convergence occurs. And quite often, the person who discovers an opportunity is in the trenches. They're down at the ground level, and suddenly it's like, oh, this isn't working. We need a better solution. I have an idea. Well, at that
Mhm.
point, whether they have money or not, is no one's going to be able to tell. The likelihood that they have enough money to bring it to market is very, very low, if non-existent, and that's why they're out looking for investment. But if an investor is going to judge this by the amount of money that's invested, I think they're using the wrong metric. I
Mhm.
think that as Ron described himself earlier in the show, Ron's been around for a while. Ron's run a number of deals. He's had successes and failures. He's what some people might call a jockey, or he's a entrepreneur, or whatever. But he's got enough of a track record that you can look at him and say, Ron's going to stick it out. Ron's going to make this work. If there's a way for it to work, Ron's going to figure out what that is. That's 10 times, 1,000 times more important than whatever amount of money or time that Ron has put into the deal. I've met a lot of first of kind wannabe entrepreneurs, have some great opportunities, but I don't know that they are necessarily going to stick it out. I don't know if they have the capability of working through the challenges along the way. So the management team in this case, the entrepreneur who's looking for money or wannabe entrepreneur, I may not be willing to place a bet on them. I may love the opportunity. I may love the technology or what the market response to this may be. But I'm looking at a person going, I don't know that they can drive the car. I don't know that they can drive the car far enough. If we have a flat tire, they'll be standing on the road looking at the tire going, I don't know how to change a tire, and these are all things I take into consideration. The amount of money that they've put in my mind, really is almost irrelevant. But Ron, we brought you
Mhm.
on as guest because you're the smart person here. What do you think in response to Harvey's question?
Yeah. Well, Harvey, that's a great question. Um, Absolutely, the entrepreneur must have skin in the game to get through that part. Yes. Um, and this would include time and effort, in my opinion. Well, it's just a fact. It could include time and effort. Um, but if the entrepreneur is not putting cash into it, and um, you don't want them continuing working their full-time job as a blank and then working on this opportunity part-time. So yes, people need money to eat, to live, and that type of thing. But what Carl said, I would echo everything he says, because the value that the entrepreneur puts in with the time and the energy, um, and handling exceptions and figuring out how to get to the next milestone, that that's more important than do we have enough money, because you could find the money, you can have the investment, you can have the money, but if you don't have a good plan and a good person executing and putting that money to work to make more money, it's irrelevant. So, and I've also come across a couple things where there was too way too much money put in very early stage by friends and family, and it's a great idea. The company may have a great idea, and they might need the next $1 million to get to, let's say, sales. But the company is diluted already, and so the valuation doesn't work out. The $1 million should buy you whatever, X% of the company, but because there's so many people already involved at a very little level, meaning little cash here, little cash there, and maybe they invested 150,000, uh, then it becomes too diluted. It's not investable anymore. So, you know, yes, the time and effort is really important, but that means that you have to give the time and the effort. You can't be working a main job and then working two part-time jobs. Then, when you have some extra time, you work on your entrepreneurial gig. That that is not good either. So, does that make sense, Carl? Hello. Okay, I think Carl dropped off. I don't see him, so maybe he has an issue. We'll wait a few minutes, but and Harvey, if you're still there, I notice in your notes, or your questions, your private chat, you have a few ideas now. So I'm assuming that means you want some money. But anyway, that's the answer to that. It's like I say, everything is different, and that's what makes entrepreneurs unique, because it's if you I've worked for big corporation before, big corporations, and you know they have uh, prescribed methodologies, management by commitment, balanced scorecards. They have KPIs. They have things in place to manage the process and keep it moving forward. But you know, they don't. That doesn't work when you're an entrepreneur and when you're in a startup. It'd be ridiculous to develop KPIs, for instance, for each team member, if you're not even at the point that you've created the product or the service. Yes, there are things such as KPIs that can be used, but it changes quickly month to month, because your goals change as you accomplish the milestones. So um, anyway, okay, Harvey, you have another one. With a startup that doesn't have any existing sales, how do people assess evaluation in terms of percent valuations? It's a great question. Um, there's books that are written on valuations, and this used to be called a black box valuation, where none of the normal valuation characteristics or metrics, Carlsbad, none of the metrics are there. So, but to value a company that doesn't have a product or service yet, you have to kind of back into that. You have to say, okay, what if this happens? What would that product or service be? And what would it be worth? What's the market that you'll sell to? Um, and then you can always establish the valuation, and then change the valuation based on future milestones that all parties agree to. I mean, like, it's not a clawback per se, but it would be a change in the valuation. So um, I think
Yeah, let
Carl's
me s let
back.
me let me s let me yeah, let me step into that. But valuation is an area where seem to be in constant combat with almost everyone. There are a number of articles posted that will talk about the different types of valuation. On 6 out of 10 are forward looking, meaning that the valuation is based upon a time in the future, which
Right.
may or may not ever happen. And yet this is the part of the investment is your hope is that one of these future valuations, particularly the higher ones, are achieved.
Hmm.
But when you go to sell a business, they tend to default to past history. What have you done recently for me? What have you done in the last couple of years? Well, in a business that's been around for 10, 15, 20 years, past history will work just fine. If it's a brand new startup or it's a growth company that's shifting from startup to a high scaling, past history means almost nothing because as they say on the TV ads, past performance is not necessarily an indicator of future performance. And in a startup, that's exactly what you want. You don't want the business to continue to be a startup. You want it to grow and scale. So if you go out far enough in time, 2, 3, 4, or 5 years, which is the time the investors want to know about, because that's when they get their money back. They don't
Hmm.
care about today. That's when they're putting their money in. So valuation is dependent upon a reasonable forward projection of what a value is going to be in the future. And then you're just saying, well, if you give me this money and I do this work, we're going to divide the money out of the future between the two of us, or the 10 of us, or 10,000 of us. And at that point, if you can come to an agreement on what the future valuation may be and what your share of that profit would be, then you can reach a deal. I've been through this so many times. Everybody's going, well, they're arguing over whether I get 10 or 12%. I'm going, what's the future value of the company? What is the investor going to put up? If they're going to put up $100,000 and in 5 years they get $200,000, which is a 20% per year average annual ROI, um, they may be happy with that. And you get to keep everything else. So I always start with what the investor needs. And if they tell me that I need all the company, then there's really no point because I don't get to keep any. And
Right.
if they say I need more than doubling my money in 5 years, I need to quadruple my money. Well, that still may be possible with certain businesses, and other businesses have no chance of attaining that kind of a return. And there's a mismatch. And so, as Ron and I have been talking about flavors of investors, one of the flavor ingredients that we look at is how much money does the investor need to get back from their investment. Some people may be quite happy with a 4 or 5%, very, very low rate of return because they're comparing it with other things that they invest in. But they typically won't do that for a high risk investment because there's a chance they won't get any of their money back. At the same time, I've had people go, "Well, I've got to get 100% per year," which is kind of an angel VC type of
Hmm.
statement. And I'm going, "That's very nice for you. If you find a company that can achieve that kind of a threshold, please let me know because I
Yeah.
rarely see one of those, and it's nice to know they exist." and and so we go down that path. When you don't have any sales, that's fine. The question isn't what sales you have today. The question is what sales are you going to have on the day that the investor wants to get paid back their investment?
Yes, and that's great analysis and a good picture that you're painting. And I'm going to you made me think of something as you were speaking, Carl. Um, that's one of the things we're looking at doing is acquiring property in Napa Valley. Okay. And so the valuation on that, looking back historically, most recently we had the pandemic and winery sales shot up. They were exorbitant. They couldn't make enough wine. And then prior to that, in the year, what was it, 2000, September 27th, 2020, they had the glass fire out there, which shut down Napa Valley for 23 days, destroyed vineyards, wineries, and put them out of business. And so when you look back historically over 5 or 7 years on how do you establish a valuation based on the past sales? That's kind of impossible. And then you have a wrinkle from, from post pandemic to now currently and going forward, where millennials, Gen X's, they're not drinking wine. The sales are dropping. So then it becomes a little nightmare thing of evaluation. So knowing that that is something I'm going through, and I'm looking at this and it's really happening, think of it when you're an entrepreneur. You don't know when the next pandemic will be, or the forest fire that wipes you out, or the flood, or the natural disaster. So, but those are exceptions. And, ideally, if you go through that, you have a good team that's skilled enough and enough money to weather it out, or to address it and take advantage of some new market opportunities that come from that. So I think of this all the time. It's not just a linear thing like that. It's a exponential 360-degree thing when you're thinking of money and valuations and such. So yeah, it's a fun world.
Yeah, but this gets back to our topic of today, which is flavors of investors.
Hmm.
And so Ron's working with half a dozen projects. I'm working with about a dozen, which is about my average. And mine cover a span where I'm certain that an investor in one project is probably highly unlikely to have any interest at all in one of my other projects. And it's nice every now and then where there's a potential overlap or convergence. But uh, a great part of what I do when I'm working with a client or a new project, including my own projects, is I start off with trying to figure out what flavor of investor I need to talk to, which one matches up with my particular project. And if the project's a startup, then as Ron's described, there's certain people aren't going to touch that. If
Right.
it's a low rate of return, there's other people aren't going to touch that. And if it's in a particular industry, it's almost impossible to get an oil and gas investor to come across and do a high tech investment. Even if we're doing LIDAR, subsurface radar to track underground pipelines for the oil and gas industry, the oil and gas guys can look at a seismic chart, but they wouldn't understand the technology that allows them to see that pipeline that's 10 feet under the ground that was buried 20 years ago, and maybe detect leaks in that pipeline, which are causing regulatory issues. So the background of the investor is very, very important. Their level of risk acceptance, which isn't always translated into rate of return. Some will say, I'm just a no risk kind of a guy or
Hmm.
gal, and I don't want any risk. I want something that's pretty well ironed out. I'll work with a low rate of return, even so, because there's no risk. I'm okay with that. So understanding who is most likely, most motivated, is part of the trick, as I see it, to getting out there and raising funding. If you go out and assume everybody's an investor, you're right occasionally. And
Yes.
the
Yeah.
problem is you don't have time to be
No.
occasionally right when looking for an investor. If this is not a Don Quixote search or the Holy Grail search where you can spend your entire lifetime, you have an opportunity, a window that you need to step into. It may disappear on you. It may be very here today, gone tomorrow kind of a thing. If you can't raise the funding in the right amount of time, you have no chance to participate in that opportunity.
Right.
So, um, to me, I have a method that I use. I start looking at what I call stakeholders, people who stand to get a benefit outside of ROI
Hmm.
from the success of the business. This could be people in the supply chain, it could be customers, it may be a social affinity, like we're helping the environment or I'm helping an underserved community. I have projects that check all these different boxes. And every time I go out there, I go, it'd be nice if I just had this black book, digital online now in a CRM, but if I had this book of investors I could go to and say,
Hmm.
hey, write me a check. But the deal's different. The risk is different. The timing's different. The market's different. We may now be in an inflationary period, or a high interest period, or we may be in a political turmoil period
Hmm.
where what somebody may have invested in yesterday is absolutely not going to work today or tomorrow. And it's this in almost infinity of different flavors of investors that makes it challenging to raise money. And the most important thing that an entrepreneur can do is try to figure out who wants this business to succeed, that it's in their self-interest for it to succeed, and therefore they really need to give you the money because they need this to happen for them, for their own interest. It's not you that they love necessarily. You're not the greatest, shiniest, most beautiful entrepreneur on the planet, and your opportunity may be totally cool, but it doesn't really matter if it doesn't help the investor with whatever they're trying to do. So Ron, what other ideas do you have? When somebody gives you a ring and says, "Ron, I've got this brand new project. I need to find some funding."
Right. Um, well, um, again, it's like each ice cream flavor, everything is unique and it's unlike the one next to it. So, you'd have to ask I would ask a series of questions, okay? And these are simple questions, but two or more wrong answers would disqualify it immediately. And, like, are you working on this full time? And no, it's an idea I have. Okay. And have you matured the idea? Have you went out to the garage and built a prototype out of wood? No, didn't think about that. And so, you need to assess it. And at this point, I never look at, oh, what has this person done historically with regard to being entrepreneurial? Because I don't know and I can't confirm it. And it could be a series of small things that they've accomplished. But right now, maybe this is a really good idea. So you just have to ask the questions and be a really good listener, and not just listening to what they say, but listening well enough that you can ask follow up questions based on what they just said. And because they're going to, if you let them talk and explain things to you, either it's going to be a big waste of time because they're so far off the mark, or it's going to be highly relevant because they're pointing out where their pain points are without labeling it like that. They can point out what their challenges are. What do they have to solve? They can even point out the fatal flaws of why this would never work. And so just let them talk. You assess it. It's a casual conversation, and that type of thing. But that's what I do when I come across or when someone's introduced to me, and I feel like at that point I have an obligation to listen more and help them out. And so that's what I do. But I do also in the last 3 years, 4 years, I cut them off more quickly than I used to. I used to just, you know, um, listen and think, okay, well, there's this, we can solve this little thing, but then the 98, 99% of it, we still haven't addressed. So at this point, if it can't happen quickly, um, then most people won't be interested in investing. Uh, yeah.
No, the vast majority of people I know who think of themselves as investors who may actually be proactively looking for investments, they want an investment that's ready to go, ready to
Yep.
launch. It's at the starting line. They very rarely will accept something where you're going, well, we're missing a vital component of this. Like, I haven't done a marketing study. I haven't built a prototype. I have no idea how to run a business. I don't know what a spreadsheet is. What is a cash flow projection? These kinds of things
Yeah.
don't mean that there isn't an opportunity.
Right.
We distinguish this. I talk about a concept as, you know, who knows? Everybody has ideas. It's not even worth talking about at the idea stage. If there's been some analysis that there's a need for this and there's a potential market and there's potential profitability, now we've moved it into the investment opportunity status, but it's still not a business because we still need resources, we need people to run the business. The person who comes up with the idea may be the worst possible person to run the business.
True.
And all too often with inventors, the best first thing they can do is replace themselves, in
Yes.
effect, fire themselves from the decision making because they don't have the background knowledge or experience to do anything beyond what they've already done, which is I've come up with a good idea.
Hmm.
So as we look at that, we just keep asking ourselves, is this ready to go? And if they're not, then they're not. Now, Ron and I, we fall in that category of people who often are called in to get businesses ready for investment or fix
Hmm.
problems. We may be part of the solution where we can figure something out, or we may become part of the team and do something. So we have a much greater tolerance for imperfections in a
Yeah.
business that need to be dealt with before it's fundable. And we may even know people who would come in earlier, who are more, I call them cowboys, who will take something that's not perfect. And if we describe what we're going to do to fix it, they'll put in a little amount of money in order to help move it to a point. And if we can fix it with that little amount of money, then they'll come in with more money afterwards, or we've moved to a completely different flavor of investor because now it's ready for investment. But
Sure.
these are a smaller subcategory of all the investors out there. There's again different reasons why they may come to the table because they're like, wow, if you could solve that problem, it would help me in my business. They're kind of like a super customer. They're really
Hmm.
not thinking of themselves as an investor, but the amount of money to solve that problem, this is something they've got to explore. And these are the kinds of things I look for as I'm trying to find somebody who's willing to go early in whatever amount of resources are required to move this to the next level. Because as we move up the ladder, as we reduce these imperfections, then more and more people are qualified, more and more flavors of investors can come into play. The cost of money comes down as a result of that. And we're moving in the right direction. But it's kind of this timeline, this movement of maturity from concept to full tilt profitable business. Where you get on to that as an investor is up to the investor, and where you get off is up to the investor, and you've got
Hmm.
to match those to the opportunity. So,
That's true.
Ron, we spent all this good time and we're getting all these great comments on the
Hmm.
show. Thanks, Harvey. Thanks, James, for your comments on the show. Any last thoughts about flavors of investment that you'd like to share with the audience before we call this a show?
Well, for I think we've solved everything. There's nothing more to talk about. No, honestly, no. This is a great. It's a great analogous thing to compare it to flavors. That's exactly what it is. And there's nothing more I can add. It's just that if you are an entrepreneur, you want to put yourself in circles where you can meet that type of investor, and that could include um, it can include like I don't know about meetup groups, but there's more formal groups around in the metro area in the Front Range as well. Whether it's Innosphere or Carl Fry's Da Vinci Institute or whatever, where you can become a member and meet like-minded people that may be able to help you. I would encourage you to do that.
Yeah, I'm actually starting a series on my instant funding newsletter for my community investment fund project. And I'm right now, this will be the topic for next week, next Monday. I'm pulling names, words, keywords, trying to figure out where are people who are already involved, already engaged, already interested, in the problem and its solution, however that might be framed, because they're out there. And whether it's a meetup group, it's a professional association, it's a local civic group, or it may be an investor group. All these people are out there, and they
Mhm.
essentially probably interested in what you're talking about. They may not be investors, but if they don't know, if they're not an investor, they may know an investor. So this
Right.
is a networking part of this, where you're saying if you've got the problem and I'm solving the problem and you don't have the money, then who do you know that does have the money? Because maybe the three of us should get together and we'll make this solution work. So thank you, Ron, for being a guest today.
Mhm.
Thank you to the audience for listening in and for your questions and comments today. And we'll be back next Tuesday on the Successful